Good afternoon. My name is Brenda Tyndall. I am Executive Director of the Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, where our mission is to foster curiosity and the spirit of discovery in visitors of all ages, enhancing public understanding of and appreciation for the natural world, science, and human cultures. This mission in mind, it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's book conversation, sponsored by our partner museums, the Harvard Museum of Natural History, the Peabody Museum, and the Collection of Historical Scientific Instruments. As we celebrate Women's History Month, I am delighted to have Sarah Richardson and Emily Oster with us to discuss the Maternal Imprint, Sarah Richardson's new book, published in 2021 by the University of Chicago Press. During the program, we will be raffling 3 copies of this wonderful book, courtesy of the publisher. So stay tuned, as you may be one of the lucky winners. And for our introductions, Sarah S. Richardson is professor of the history of science and studies of women, gender, and sexuality at Harvard University and directs the Harvard Gender Sci Lab, a historian and philosopher of science. Sarah is a leading scholar of gender and science whose work argues for conceptual rigor and social responsibility in scientific research on sex, gender, sexuality, and reproduction. In addition to the book she will be discussing today, Sarah is author of Sex Itself: The Search for Male and Female in the Human Genome. She has also published 2 edited volumes, Revisiting Race in the Genomic Age and Post-Genomics: Perspectives on Biology After the Genome. She is author of multiple articles published by peer-reviewed journals and by popular forums, such as Slate, the New York Times, and the Boston Globe. We also have Emily Oster, who is professor of economics at Brown University and the author of Expecting Better, Crib Sheet, and The Family Firm. She holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Oster's academic work focuses on health economics and statistical methods. Her books analyze the data behind choices in pregnancy and parenting. We will begin tonight's program with a short presentation by Professor Richardson, in which she will provide an overview of the maternal imprint, and afterwards, she and Emily Oster will engage in a conversation and also take questions from the public. You can submit questions at any time by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now it is indeed my pleasure to welcome Sarah Richardson to the Zoom stage. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much. I could not be more delighted to be here. Thank you to the Harvard Museums and Brenda Tyndall and to Diana Munn, and especially to Emily Oster. I could not be more delighted to be in conversation with you. I'm going to begin with an overview of this book, The Maternal Imprint, which is about what to me is a bewitching idea that the environment in which you are gestated leaves a permanent imprint on you and your future descendants. Let me begin by situating what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the direct passage of teratogens, toxins across the placenta to offspring. I'm talking about a different register of claims in which maternal effects are passed during the gestational period in a way that enters into our conversations and discourse about heredity and the role of biology in determining life outcomes. So I am interested in scientific speculations of the sort pictured here, looking at the intergenerational transmission of effects that are speculated to be produced by the intrauterine maternal environment. In these images, which increasingly characterize the forms of inquiry in the post-genomic life sciences, scientists are interested in modeling at the level of biological mechanisms how it is that bodies take up their environments with implications for health and life outcomes. And in these new sciences, the maternal-fetal relation has emerged as a special space for exploring these leading edge questions in the life sciences. In the book, I present a history of maternal effects science from the advent of the genetic age in the late 19th century to the present day. And I'm tracking three intertwined dimensions of scientific speculations about the long reach of the maternal intrauterine imprint. Interest in the power of maternal effects science to disrupt genetic determinist ideas about human fate. Secondly, conceptual and empirical debate over how to study such effects, given their crypticity. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. They blink in and out. Their effect sizes are small. The mechanisms are often missing. And finally, I'm interested in the implications of claims making in the field of maternal intrauterine effects science for women's well-being and autonomy. And what I find is that in each historical period, scientists' views about what can be scientifically studied and indeed known about human maternal fetal effects are entangled with cultural beliefs about women's and men's reproductive responsibilities, and also shaped by scientists' politically and historically situated convictions about the relative importance of genes and social environment to human life outcomes. Now, these claims have a wide reach. For example, there have been important emerging narratives from this field trying to examine the intergenerational transmission of the effects of trauma, such as experiencing the Holocaust. The neuroscientist Rachel Yehuda has said that these new sciences of maternal fetal effects can tell us that what happens to our parents, or perhaps even to our grandparents or previous generations, may help shape who we are on a fundamental molecular level that contributes to our behaviors, beliefs, strengths, and vulnerabilities. And these kinds of claims, beyond the realms even of memory and history, the science of maternal fetal effects has become one of the fields of speculation through which we understand and process risk and uncertainty in our present world. There's a substantial body of literature looking at the intrauterine effects of having been in the womb during the 2001 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, for example. And today, researchers are interested in what being gestated during the COVID-19 pandemic will mean for the future of this cohort of infants. Now, all of this research is part of a huge number of developments that have led to an efflorescence in recent years of scientific interest in the long-term effects of the intrauterine environment. So from psychiatric disorders to the interest in the effects of maternal factors such as diet, stress, and environmental exposures. Some of the outcomes that are of interest include obesity, heart disease, autism, asthma, and even things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and intelligence. Now, while scientific interest in the imprint left by the womb has a long history, the proximate foundation of this modern day field is found in a field called Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, or DOHAD. And this traces to investigations in the late 1980s, where researchers, epidemiologists, looked at historical health records from the poorest areas of England, and then found that the communities that 50 years earlier had the highest infant mortality rates, well, 50 years later, they had the highest heart disease rates. And so these researchers developed a body of theory and emerging evidence linking early life experiences, especially during pregnancy, to later health outcomes in areas of great interest and of great social expense, so like chronic diseases. 3 decades later, this hypothesis drives multiple lines of inquiry at the intersection of many fields: developmental biology, teratology, nutrition science, epigenetics. And as of just a few years ago, more than 130,000 papers on fetal programming of disease are available in the biomedical research database PubMed. So in sum, in this area of research, which is today human maternal-fetal epigenetic programming research, scientists cohere cryptic findings into bold biosocial theories, which locate causality and agency in the intrauterine period. And the explanations that are produced in this field are compelling, because they collapse scales of biological materiality from the molecular to the macrosomic, levels of biological and social analysis from metabolism to wartime trauma, and temporalities of memory, intergenerationality, and history into highly specific quantitative claims about levels of DNA methylation. So these are compelling narratives that are filled with urgency by the specter of fetal harm, and with promise by researchers' pronouncements that a forthcoming applied science of fetal programming can redress it. Oops. Now, these claims, historically, interest in the imprint left by the intrauterine period, it has a very long history, and the reservoir of that we can go to immediately is maternal impression science. And this is, well, it's not just science, but it's a body of folk and vernacular theory that has persisted for many hundreds of years and can be, and maybe even thousands of years, and can be found cross-culturally, which refers to notions that a mother's countenance, ambient environment, fleeting impressions, diet, and so on during pregnancy imprint on her developing fetus, marking it for life and contributing to its future character. These theories asserted that heredity was not simply constituted by the transmission of material at the moment of conception. Rather, heredity encompassed the totality of characters shaped by the mother and the father before birth. So these ideas that held that maternal contributions to the next generation were qualitatively, if not quantitatively, different than paternal contributions were challenged beginning in the late 19th century by emerging genetic theory. But they didn't disappear right away. They persisted into the 20th century. And these ideas united with eugenic notions, progressive notions of uplift through health, to produce new, updated 20th century ideas that we're talking about the early 20th century that I characterize in the book as prenatal culture. So one of the contributions of the book is to recover the long history of these ideas and how they persisted into our own communities, our own histories, into eugenic thought, and into various strands of progressive thought as well. These ideas offered a different stance towards scientific knowledge, appealing to everyday experience, common sense, and the likelihood that perhaps some realities may escape scientific probes and measures. Some of my favorite material from prenatal culture, which was a set of ideas from roughly the 1880s to around 1920, include the idea that through uplift in bodily conditioning during the prenatal period, women could be empowered. So these ideas united with maternalist ideas about and feminist ideas about women's progress. My favorite example is given here on this slide by the California suffragist Georgiana Bruce Kirby, who in her book Transmission or variation of character through the mother, which really typifies this body of thought from this period, argued that as society comes to realize women's great maternal power, as she called it, in the transmission of traits during pregnancy, Kirby predicted that, quote, her character will broaden, her thoughts enlarge, and subserviency will no more belong to her than her brother. So in the United States, prenatal culturalists combined eugenic and progressive era ideas about social uplift through bodily conditioning with new theories about the critical importance of very early experience. And some of their language and ideas sound strikingly like emerging ideas today. They focused on brain development. They focused on directing resources to women to empower them through reproductive education and options. And they proposed that the importance of these effects should compel investment of resources in the realm of women's physical development and so on. Now, compared to that era, today's scientific speculations on maternal intrauterine effects benefit from a greatly expanded body of epidemiological data on the prenatal period. Beginning in the late 1980s, scientists initiated large-scale prospective cohort studies. They tracked mothers and their offspring from pregnancy onwards. One of them pictured here is the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children, or ALSPAC, at Bristol University in the United Kingdom. This study began in 1991, enrolling almost 14,000 pregnant women, and today it's one of the largest studies attempting to track long-term effects of prenatal exposures. And ALSPAC typifies this newer era in that it's collected copious biological samples from the children and mothers, and DNA, also from the children and mothers at many, many time points along their development. Even the children's baby teeth reside in the study's data bank collected by the study's appointed tooth fairy. And these kinds of troves of data have produced many associations between prenatal effects and later outcomes. The question, of course, is causality and dealing with the many forms of confounding and some areas of lacking data. As I point out in an extended analysis of this work in the book, for example, very few of these studies collect anywhere close to, or sometimes any data, anywhere close to the amount of data on fathers compared to mothers. But DOHAD science and fetal origin science is not just mountains of data correlating prenatal exposures with later outcomes. This research is combined with a set of guiding assumptions that serve as a conceptual framework for interpreting these data. So researchers today believe that human developmental plasticity is greatest during the critical period of intrauterine growth, and that prenatal cues from the maternal environment can permanently program the developing fetus in ways that impact physiological functioning as an adult. And the sensitivity of human fetuses to their maternal environment, they believe, is an evolutionary adaptation, allowing fetuses to attune themselves to their expected postnatal environment. And so this produces the so-called mismatch hypothesis, suggesting that if, say, metabolic and stress signals from the mother's body do not match the physical environment that the fetus encounters, as in the case of, say, a nutritionally deprived fetus entering a calorie-rich American dietary landscape, illness results. And this argument, as I mentioned earlier, has been influentially and provocatively tied to Western diseases of affluence, such as breast cancer and heart disease, right, as driven by a rapid lifestyle shift. And importantly, because aspects of the intrauterine environment that a woman provides are themselves set by her own development in the womb, this mismatch between fetal programming and postnatal environment may, many claim, take several generations to disappear. So here is one kind of model in this arena. Many DOHAD researchers believe that intrauterine effects in this way help explain how social inequalities persist and become embodied and pass across generations. So here is one such model from University College London pediatrician and child nutrition expert Jonathan Wells, who argues that rising rates of metabolic disorders and obesity are somatic manifestations of the intergenerational transmission of health inequalities. So this science of maternal effects, which draws on many strands of research from genetics to nutrition, developmental biology, teratology, and so on, can be united around the idea of maternal effects, a term coined in 1934, a sort of phenomenological term to talk about this category of observed effects without really committing too much to any particular theory of them. We use the term maternal effects in science to refer to, as Jason Wolfe and Michael Wade have said, the causal influence of the maternal genotype or phenotype on the offspring phenotype, generally through the maternally provided environment. And this, of course, offers a different picture of heredity than the one that we learned in high school genetics, right? It suggests that mothers endow the fetus with more than just DNA, that infants are programmed as they develop by maternal factors that influence the environment in which they grow. And this is part of an upswing of interest in the biosocial, how our bodies are mediated by our environments starting at conception. So I wrote this book to explore my draw to these claims and my worries about these claims. In short, my ambivalence about these claims. So while I'm very drawn to the idea that bodies register their social and physical environments in ways that are profound and also subtle, today's maternal effects science is also raising a set of troubling questions. As intellectually exciting and perhaps socially important as these investigations are, the present intensive focus on a narrow window of human development, gestation, and on a particular class of bodies, women of reproductive age, requires scrutiny. So situating the intrauterine environment as a critically determinative one for a range of life outcomes articulates social alarm through women's reproductive bodies in ways that can and have carried real implications for restrictions on women's reproductive autonomy. And moreover, even if these effects exist, an exaggerated focus on the mother as the bearer of reproductive risk may misdirect resources from other more important contributors to health and life outcomes. And furthermore, as I argue in 2 chapters of the book that reanalyze key studies in the field, this really is an area where intellectual excitement runs ahead of actual empirical findings. So although scientists today have more data than ever and more precise tools than ever for studying the biochemical relation between a mother and fetus, the science of maternal effects involves connecting unstable biological markers to small effects many decades later. So all of these questions compelled me to try to reconstruct a genealogy of these ideas and understand their varying social valences and philosophical conformations. If I have a few more minutes, I will just walk through a few of the contributions of the book. As I noted earlier, maternal effects contravenes a founding premise of the modern theory of genetic inheritance, that males and females contribute equally to the next generation. And the book really begins with this history, reconstructing this principle of sex equality of heredity as it was developed by August Weismann, the architect of the so-called germplasm theory of heredity in the late 19th century. So Weismann held that the egg and sperm are isolated from the ravages endured by other bodily cells, and that the female and male gametes contribute equally to the next generation. And as noted, that was really a radical break from previous reigning ideas about heredity under the umbrella of maternal impressions theories. And Weissman's ideas, despite the persistence of prenatal culture, really led to a consensus for some period of time that really there was little impact of the prenatal period or the intrauterine period on life outcomes. Here are some examples from the US Children's Bureau's first manual on prenatal care and from the Journal of Heredity, pronouncing that there's very little, assuring mothers and pronouncing for scientists that parents can do very little to determine the fate of their children. Because according to this worldview, really your fate was determined by heredity contained in the gametes, the egg and the sperm. What's interesting to me as a gender historian is to see what very different reproductive biopolitics, this other world view of where agency, where the locus was for reproductive risk. So when it was believed that the germ cells, the gametes, the egg and the sperm, determine outcomes, well, then scientists emphasized above all the importance of the health and maintenance of the sperm and egg. And so prevailing ideas led to locating parental reproductive responsibilities, not just in the woman, but mainly in the period prior to conception. And at the time, prevailing ideas held that environmental risks were most likely to be introduced by men with their riskier lifestyles, occupations, and consumption patterns. So up until the 1930s, in contrast to perhaps DOHAD science today and maternal impressions theory before, scientists focused their prenatal advice far more on the preconception period and on men than on intrauterine exposures and women. Men were exhorted to protect their sperm by abstaining from alcohol, undergoing regular syphilis treatment, and maintaining their bodies in overall good health. So how did we get from there to here? Many strands, not all of which I can reconstruct right here, but one of the most interesting ones is the history of speculations about population variation in birth weights. So in the 1950s and 1960s, birth weight began to be regularly collected as a demographic variable, and researchers seized upon it as a possibly rich variable reflecting on fetal well-being. On average, Black Americans are born smaller than white Americans. And this is a longstanding disparity, and its implications for health and social inequities across lifespan has been a matter of debate among biologists, epidemiologists, and social scientists. Now, it was during this period in the 50s and 60s that, in contrast to previous ideas that held that the racial disparity was genetic, scientists drawing on maternal effects theories, forged the hypothesis that racial differences in birth weight demonstrate that racial discrimination and deprivations can leave a mark even before birth. They posited that the intrauterine environment might serve as a mechanism for amplifying these effects across generations. And these theories ran their way through the reproductive sciences. So here is a figure from a prominent placentologist, a reproductive physiologist, theorizing how the maternal body could become a vector for social ills and socioeconomic deprivation. And debates over racial differences in birth weight infused the maternal effects science with a progressive, social justice-oriented, anti-genetic determinist fever, and raised the prospect of mining the prenatal period for cryptic, as yet acknowledged, drivers of health and social inequalities. And this vision of prenatal growth metrics as right material for formulating these biosocial hypotheses about how inequality gets under the skin linked maternal effects science to a dramatic and astonishing picture of present-day human bodies as dialectically constructed by past environments. And this entanglement of maternal effects science with this project of elucidating the biological dimensions of social inequalities is really critical to understanding the trajectory of the field up to the present day. I have just a minute left, so I will quickly talk about the present day. So today, the focus has shifted from birth weight, which for reasons I describe in very complex discussion in one of the chapters, is really too crude of a measure of fetal outcomes to support causal hypotheses about maternal pregnancy effects. Now, maternal effects researchers have turned their attention to the new science of epigenetics, which refers to molecular changes in the regulatory apparatus of the genome. And epigenetic markers can change in response to environmental stimuli. And the idea is if these changes can be shown to be induced by the intrauterine environment, remain stable over time, and have functional implications for human health, they may offer a mechanism for the long-term effects of maternal pregnancy exposures. And this cartoon that I'm showing here is quite typical for the field today, where you have sort of a headless female, very pregnant abdomen with arrows leading in, arrows leading out. And I find this one funny. At the very end, all arrows lead to an ambulance carrying away the future offspring. And this kind of punitive and harsh discourse about good mothers and bad mothers has also undergirded and carried forward this speculative field of science and written its way into the very representations and language and global frameworks of the science that, despite the progressive aims of this work, has also created a positioning of these new sciences as suggesting who's optimum, who's worthy of investment, who's permanently lesioned, and so on. The problem, as I see it, is the disjoint between social categories and what the biological measures actually capture. In the excitement over epigenetics, what we see is a way in which the biological, and particularly the molecular and genetic, becomes privileged with explanatory authority as a measure of concrete realities, and fits social facts into a biological framework that characterizes some people as permanently lesioned, as carrying developmental deficiencies, and in which the environment is a human woman whose own rights and ability to make autonomous choices fade from view. Conceptualizing biochemical responses to the intrauterine environment as programmed, permanent, and even heritable, the result is a picture of fetuses inflicted with self-perpetuating biological deficits. And here I'm borrowing from the scholar Dorothy Roberts, who has also written about this from the perspective of race. And the outcome of this conceptual scheme, writes Roberts, is not merely failure to factor in broader social factors, but active obfuscation of the existence of ongoing deficits. So to conclude, epigenetic research on maternal effects advances a model of human inheritance and development in which the wider social and physical environment can be seen as heritable and as a determinant of future biomedical outcomes. But, my work argues that rather than really challenging genetic determinism and biological reductionism, these present day programs appropriate and modify these discourses to include a particular conception of social determinants of health, one that places the maternal-fetal relation at the center. And this image from the cover of Der Spiegel on epigenetics makes clear how the embedded body and the environment is embodied by a receding sort of a figure of the woman, and appreciating how gender sort of plays a role in these discourses about who is has the ability to change and control the future, right? I think is necessary to fully understand the implications of this highly speculative new science that is going to be a force in representing or making plausible the environment as it interrelates with our understanding of biology. Okay, thank you very much. And I would love to invite Emily Oster into the conversation at this point.
Hello. So that was fantastic. And I want to start by saying just really how much I liked this book, and really for me, sort of how much it spoke to me. And I think it really spoke to me in sort of two ways that I want to get at a little bit in this conversation. So one is the kind of piece of it about how we talk to pregnant women, how we talk to sort of women as a vessel rather than a person. So I want to talk about that piece. The other thing it talks to me that speaks to me is the data and causality and me complaining about causality, which is of course my absolute just favorite. So I want to touch on both of those, but I want to start with the first one because I speak a lot to pregnant women, and one of the feelings that I think many people have in pregnancy is the idea of sort of like autonomy being removed, and you used to be a person and now you're a vessel, and then afterwards you're just like a lactation oriented accessory, right? That you're kind of losing yourself, and that more than that, there's many things to mess up. That there's a sort of constant did you do it right? Did you do it right? And blaming, both self-blaming and society blaming for kind of things that may go wrong or ways in which things are not, your baby is not an Olympian and that's somehow because you did the wrong thing. And when people ask me about this, they often will say, was it always like this? Like people have in their mind, Mad Men or something where like all the women who are pregnant are smoking a cigarette and having a cocktail and no one's kind of judging them at all. But what I think is so striking about the book is this sort of look back over such a long frame to say, actually, versions of this show up in many time periods back, almost until the beginning of when we record that. So I guess what I would ask about that is, it's showing up in a little bit of a different way in all of these different time periods. And to what extent do you think that's just reflecting kind of the current, whatever is the current moment, the sort of current obsessions? Or we're obsessed with IQ. We're thinking all about the things you could do wrong to make your kid smarter or less smart. And at some other point it's appearance. So it's, what are they looking at? But I'd just be interested to hear your thoughts on that sort of connection with the time.
Absolutely. I mean, this is why I bring in the example of Georgiana Kirby, even this short vignette, because to see sort of proto-feminists using the idea of maternal influences is so different than many of the discourses that you see today, which, as you say, are often have very harsh and even dehumanizing ideas of the woman as a vessel or a container, fetal container.
Container.
Yes. And so I think one thing that is distinctive, like now compared to before, although there has always been this body of advice, that body of advice did not always carry the imprimatur of the elite molecular sciences. And it didn't occur in a period in which birth and pregnancy was as medicalized and technologized as it is today, where we live in an era of intensive parenting that is also medicalized, and it is a norm and expectation that one will look to science and indeed conform one's behavior to advice from science, so that women and good evidence from across a variety of disciplines really shows this, that women take in this kind of advice very quickly, and it becomes part of the embodied experience of being pregnant. And as you said, the advice often comes in the form of what you're either, with any action, you're either harming the outcomes for your fetus or helping. There's no gray area.
Nothing is neutral. Nothing you do is neutral.
Right, exactly. And that is this very harsh very seductive frame. Even cognitive scientists have even studied this and said, like, this frame, once you have the idea that someone could be harming a fetus, it's very hard to get out of. And so one of the prescriptions in the book is we need a better conversation, a better way of talking about risk, and a better way of understanding highly uncertainty in science and how to navigate through that. Both the scientists and the public health folks and the people who are at the receiving end of this advice.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of risk. There's really a difference here between risk and uncertainty, because risk is something where which is quantifiable, right? There's a number. And a lot of what's here is almost uncertainty in processing that, or being uncertain about the size of the risk, or just how do we process small numbers. We can see what the risk is, but there's our brains are not very good at that. They crave certainty, which is sort of the cognitive science piece of this.
Yeah. Emily, this is what I love about your work. You are really part of a generation of scientists who know the science, can crunch the numbers, and you have shown in a lot of your work that oftentimes when you look at these prescriptions, the science underlying it is dubious, or it's contested, conflicting, and the effect sizes are small. And that is really, really important work. And some of what I'm doing in this book is sort of using the tools of history, philosophy, social studies of science to say, how did we get here? Yeah. Where such uncertain claims and such small sizes of risk become prescriptions immediately brought into advice to women. And I think we need a conversation about these forms of science that actually increasingly, I think, characterize the contemporary molecular, data-rich biomedical sciences. And that is this search for patterns or cryptic effects believed not to have been detectable before, but now we will find them. And we always thought they were there, and it's common sense that they are there. We're just going to find them. And right. And so this idea of causal crypticity is the way I enter this, and it's compelling to me, how we think about causality and how that changes over time. As I show in this field of research, from its inception, it's always been characterized by a kind of crisis around what is scientifically knowable and what kinds of norms are needed in the field to establish claims as true.
And I think part of it sort of gets in the second thing I wanted to ask about, but I think part of what I'm sort of drawn to is sometimes we are better at learning big effects in this space, and then we want to translate them to small effects. So the example I think of is, and somebody asked about this, I think in the Q&A, there are some of these very big sort of moments of deprivation. So the Dutch famine, some of what happened during the Great Leap Forward, the 1918 flu, where because of the timing of those events and the sharpness and the fact that people were pregnant during them, you can actually really do a much better job on making a causal argument that, having the flu in your first trimester of pregnancy has long-term impacts on the health of the baby, or having being part of the Great Leap Forward, which was not forward, has these sort of long-term impacts, right? So you can sort of dial into these very big events and find these effects. And the causality there is more compelling because of the way you're doing it. And so that's okay, we've learned something maybe that's causal, although maybe we could disagree about it. But at any rate, even imagining that we learned something causal, you then sort of want to take that piece of information and somehow translate it into, well, what if you had a tiny amount of this, right? And so we go from being in utero in this incredibly dangerous, significant flu, having the flu, the 1918 flu is very serious, gets translated into people thinking, if I had a fever, I'm just everything is over. Right. And you sort of how do we dial back from, or help people understand that a fever is not one, nth of the flu, but in fact, that's not really how these things kind of work.
Absolutely. And a good example of that I discuss in the book is birth weight. We know being very low birth weight, being teeny tiny, which is mostly caused by being born gestationally born early, it carries a lot of implications. But most of the research that's been done on birth weight correlating with like the hot topics like IQ or what have you is births in the normal range, right? So they move from that finding to, okay, 6.5 pound to 7.5 pound, are there gradations, right, in all of these outcomes? So this is what I mean by crypticity. We're talking about small exposures, and we're talking about small effects. Even with the Dutch famine studies, and that's a study that I'm like deeply drawn to because my own grandmother lived through the Dutch famine, and as an adolescent, they were consuming fewer than 400 calories on many days. They have measurements of it, and sibling comparisons. I mean, if good work is going to be done, it's going to look like this. And I analyzed the Dutch hunger winter studies in the book alongside some other comparable studies, and even those where you have like extreme deprivation, the effects are small. And they're not ecologically stable, and they're in one sex or the other. So we're talking about like 2 centimeters extra of waist adiposity at age 59, right? And those are extreme gestational exposures, right?
But I would push back. People say, well, but don't you want to give your kid the best? Like, do you, even if it was a small effect, like what, don't you, and like we almost get into this thing, which is like anything which could be a small effect for the baby that would be positive is worth a sort of infinite amount of like kind of sacrifice by the mother. And there's just like an attitude there almost.
Right. And where does it end then? Like at what point, living, breathing, driving a car, right? And so if you carry that argument far enough, you even have people saying, well, maybe women shouldn't work while they're pregnant, right? And that actually has come up in the current epigenetics discussions, right? So we need to have a robust conversation around this science that is aware of and accountable to like a range of social spaces that the science might enter into, and the very real restrictions up to and including criminal attempts to charge women criminally, to imprison them, or court orders changing their lifestyle, or even removal of children. These are very real outcomes. And in a moment of trying reproductive politics, they do feed into a wider and concerning move away from women's reproductive autonomy.
I agree. And I mean, I think the other thing to think about as I read the book is there's almost a feeling sometimes like, well, if we just got better evidence, when we have this world of like the primacy of science, and that it's okay. Yeah, maybe we don't know everything, but the way forward is to get better evidence. So we don't understand everything about how exposures among women translate to their kid, to their baby, because we don't understand everything about the placenta. We don't understand everything about, this. And so, but if we could just understand better, then we would be able to optimize this. So it's almost like science is the problem, but then we think the solution is more science. And some of what I think you're saying is like the solution maybe is not more science. Like it's not obvious that we're having a conversation that is very similar in a world in which we understand tremendously more to the one we were having about whether, seeing an ugly dog during your pregnancy is the cause of that birthmark. Like we've advanced, but we're still having the same conversation.
That's right. I think that it's absolutely true. And I relate in the book really key scientific developments in the science of reproductive biology. But this isn't a problem that more data will solve these fundamental questions of how we weigh risk, how we understand uncertainty, and the considerable ecological specificity and changes over time in what fetal exposures mean in the context of whole lives. And so, we can't just sit back and wait for science to answer. Science will out and resolve these issues. We need ways of talking about risk, uncertainty, the underdetermination of these claims, and really placing them in the context of much larger social and structural risks to outcomes. The intensive focus on the gestational period is a worry for me. It's not that we shouldn't study it. It's utterly fascinating, but placing it in the context of what is well known about how structural inequities of all kinds determine life outcomes. And I mean, there was one quip by a scientist I talk about in the book where the researcher, one of the founders of this field of contemporary research, said, probably the womb is more important than the home. Well, there's almost nothing that we understand about human life outcomes that would support that. Right. The family and the home and the community environment that you're born into is critically determinative of life outcomes. So you see the narrowing of the perspective into this, maternal-fetal physiological relation. And that is concerning in the bigger picture.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of both. It has sort of two, I think, pernicious negative effects. One is to make women kind of blame themselves for almost anything that goes, anything that goes wrong. Well, what did I do? What did I do? There's this sort of story of what did I do that made this not kind of work out like I wanted? But then there's this sort of societal piece of it absolves us of some responsibility. If the womb is, the womb is on you. And, we don't need to think about pre-K or childcare or, good quality schooling or whatever, because it's, because you did the womb. And so if you just do that right, you're all set there.
Yeah, on the blaming selves, I cite these studies by a researcher who interviewed, 1/3 of women are categorized as obese presently, and interviewed women who are categorized as obese about their experiences receiving this advice. And it was incredible, the level of trauma and self-hate that they had after hearing this advice. One of them said, I felt I had failed at parenting even before I had become a parent. And just thinking actually of the stress and harm of these kinds of discourses to pregnant women themselves, right? Weighing it in the context of building one's own identity as a mother and starting a life as a parent. We really need to think about how we support mothers in flourishing, no matter what their bodies, no matter where they're located.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience. First, I want to announce that we have 3 book raffle winners who will get to read Sarah's book and are very lucky. They are Joanne Duraco, Wenfei Tong, and Megan Bonkers. And you guys will get an email about your free book, so congratulations. Okay, so I want to start with this. I think actually connects very closely in some ways to what you just said. The question is, how would you counsel policymakers about workplace safety and accommodations for pregnant women? You don't want to blame women for pregnancy outcomes. We also want to make sure the current work culture is not exposing them to harmful effects. So I think the question is sort of, how do you balance the need for those things with the kind of, let's let everybody do the things that they want?
Oh, wow. What a great question. Well, the first thing I would say is that everyone has reproductive bodies, both women and men. And there's quite a bit of evidence that men's reproductive life prospects are also influenced by environmental toxins and factors. So let's rejigger that framework to include everyone with reproductive bodies. Secondly, we want to, it is a line to walk between what could be seen as a form of paternalism, right? And individuals' rights to determine for themselves which risks are acceptable in the context of their lives. So one would wish for the possibility for some level of dialogue and weighing risks in the workplace. But again, I would push the idea that we need a balanced notion of risk, and that reproductive risk isn't the only kind of bodily or health risk that could be induced in the workplace. We'd all be better off with a healthier, wider conversation about those risks.
Yeah, no, I think it's right. The sort of privileging of this particular risk as opposed to the other is like very. So I like this. I like this question on the data piece. So are there any good studies of the relative importance of different things? So to be only a little facetious, they say, could you compare not smoking during pregnancy versus doing yoga during pregnancy and somehow get at like what's a ranking of what's important to do?
I want to turn this question over to you, Emily, because I'm looking at a different register of claims. I'm looking at these subtle intergenerational, like associating very small exposures that are not teratogens like alcohol or smoking with intergenerational or long-term life outcomes and small variations in them. So that's the register of claims I'm looking at. Is it possible to weigh them against each other? I really would be curious, Emily, what you have to say about this. But, I think of the multiple confounding of these things, the problems with effect sizes.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I think that our evidence on any one of, there's a few cases like smoking where I think we have somewhat better evidence about some outcomes, but in general, we have almost no good evidence on most of these things. And I think that's part of what has led us to this kind of like tremendously to just putting them all on a list and being like, here are all the things people ever mentioned as being kind of not good or being good. And they're all kind of equally, as if they're all sort of equally supported in the world, as opposed to you doing some kind of ranking and saying, if my friend's OB told her like, just don't smoke cigarettes and it's basically fine, which of course is not quite right. But, had at least a little bit of a ranking. But I think the answer is that there's no good data. Okay, so this is so I think the tendency to attribute tiny in utero exposures to major subsequent events is related to a desire for control over women and by women over their offspring. Because seeing things as all or nothing is easier than a nuanced view, and it removes responsibility for later outcomes that arise from the larger social environment. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
Yeah.
Well said, my friend.
Yeah, I think it is this sort of like but it's interesting there. I think that there's this sort of control over women, but also your like sort of the people's desire to understand, to have a reason for why something has happened.
Because I mean, not to interrupt, but these are we are under intense pressure to optimize outcomes, reproductive outcomes. The consequences are huge, especially in societies that don't have strong social supports. The consequences are painted as huge if things aren't optimal, and they often are. And so, yes, the pressure for control comes from many different directions, and is very internalized by many of us.
So this is a couple of people asked a version of this question, particularly in the context of the current of the current war. So on the one hand, one certainly does not want to burden pregnant women with excessive and undue worrying and blame about their offspring. However, trauma caused by famines or genocide, or I would add in war here, is potentially reason to hold perpetrators accountable and show support. I mean, to what extent do you think this is a way to sort of think about some of the costs of some of the trauma that people experience?
Well, the question is, do we need precise measures of methylation effects at the maternal-fetal interface to talk in concrete ways about trauma? And that's what interests me, like the need to validate it with or measure it at the maternal-fetal interface. There is, I think, at the heart of that is a frustration, a concern that we can't talk about trauma. We can't prove it. We can't get it across to policymakers or the people leading wars if we can't basically healthize it and make it a health outcome. And that there's a certain way in which I see in that a desire within a very contested space to break through the discourse and garner attention. So it isn't, I question the molecularization of it. But certainly we should be concerned about any vulnerable people in times of war and what the implications will be for those people and for those communities as a whole.
Yeah. But I think one way to sort of restate what you're saying, which I think is very meaningful, is that, we should care, we should be very engaged with those issues, full stop, having nothing to do with whether there's an epigenetic link between this and this thing and the other thing, that this is something where this is just like per se quite bad. And it's not as clear that we need that extra moment. So I'm going to ask one more question because we're just about out of time, which is really about sort of translating this to a kind of patient audience. This person says they're an OBGYN resident. How would you counsel patients about sort of control their desire to optimize? Like patients, they hear this, they didn't read your book. So maybe the answer is give them your book and my book. That's yes. my best answer. But I think, to sort of say, like, we live in a culture in which this is very central and people are hearing it all the time. How do you get people to dial it back?
Right. I think that's right. I have lots of crazy examples from history of advice given to pregnant women that could be fun to trot out in that scenario. I do think that humor and lightening it up and some of those examples, my favorite is that women were counseled to do math equations while pregnant to increase the mathematical acumen of their offspring. And I kind of dig that.
But isn't this just like play music to your womb so your kid is smart? Isn't this literally just the same as the Mozart effect?
I just love the precision of you will do the thing and they will have the same, it directly translates to the same. That we live under conditions I'm speaking here about populations similar to those who live in North America, where we live in an immensely privileged time of tremendous well-being and very optimum health, better than any time previous. And as well, it's nice to read about these things, keep a perspective, keep a sense of humor, and think about the experiences of mothers past and the advice that they received. The historical perspective can be absolutely invaluable, I think, in making strange our present moment.
Awesome. This was so great. I think Brenna is going to come. Brenna, are you going to come back with us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah and Emily, for just a fascinating conversation. Many thanks to our audience for posing some really robust questions and helping to drive what has been just an amazing conversation. I can't wait to read the book cover to cover. Also, thanks to our partners, the Harvard Museum of Natural History, the Peabody Museum, and the Collection of Scientific Instruments for co-sponsoring this event. And of course, thanks to our wonderful audience for tuning in. To learn more about HMSC and our programs, visit us at hmsc.harvard.edu. Take care. Have a great evening.